might even put Al Jazeera in that category. You probably could now put the Washington Post in that category. It was purchased recently by someone of extraordinary wealth. But in the United States, we've got 1,500, 1,600 daily newspapers. We've got that number of local television affiliates. And the very rich are not going to bail out all of those. I think what you'll see is the very rich looking for opportunities. The Washington Post is an important brand, and brand is important in the news industry. Second to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, it probably is the top newspaper brand in the United States. That can be attractive to someone who's very wealthy. I think in terms of Greenwald and that possibility, I think there was an idea there that a certain type of journalism, if funded well, could really shed light on things that are not being illuminated, and that was a very attractive in that case. And of course, in the case of Al Jazeera, it was an attempt, and an important attempt, and to some degree and in some parts of the world very successful in bringing part of the story being untold about the Middle East to the public's attention. So I think there will be those kinds of opportunities, and there will be some interest on the part of the very wealthy to jump into those places, but it's not going to solve the problem of the media system writ large.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next couple of questions come from a journalist, Tom Murphy. He's based in the Boston area. Yeah. He works on international development and humanitarian issues. And his first question is, what are your thoughts on the balance between simplicity and complexity in international reporting?
Well, that's a tough one. And I think it's really hard. I mean, one of the hardest areas to report in, and I'm talking in terms of the marketplace, is foreign or international reporting. Americans don't have very much appetite for it, and therefore editors and publishers don't have a lot of appetite for it. And so I think there are a lot of compromises that are forced on the journalist in that situation. But to me, nearly every area of public policy has extraordinary complexity, and the way that journalists can think about trying to deal with that, and you've got an audience, of course, that you've got to get their attention, and they don't study the news; they follow the news. So there's a need for simplification in the coverage, but the simplification occurs to me in the story. The simplification does not occur across the range of stories that are used to cover a particular area of our public life. And there you build complexity in by bringing in dimensions that need to be seen but are rarely seen. So that, again, much of the international coverage is all about crises and war and the like. And in some ways that's the way the newsrooms tend to look at what the audience can be interested in. I mean, if you look at the coverage of Africa, it's almost entirely negative. So it's about things like AIDS, and it's about the wars that are going on there. We don't get the good stories coming out of Africa. That's a different kind of simplification than simplification in the context of a story. That's the simplification of the large picture of Africa, and to me that's the larger problem in journalism.
Yeah, thank you. Tom's second question is, given the journalism industry's trend, why do you think media outlets would publish more knowledge-based reporting?
Well, I think to some degree there's not strong evidence that they would. But I think we have pretty strong evidence now that weak reporting is bad for business. There have been a number of studies, one by the Project for Excellence in Journalism, and that shows that weak reporting is very costly to the news industry. Infotainment is costly in the long run, not the short run, to the news industry. That if you degrade the product, at some point people are going to start looking for alternatives. And according to some studies, as many as a third of Americans have left a source that they trusted and found other sources because they simply thought the news had lost its integrity, had lost its value. Now, what we see on the web is we do see more direct evidence that you might possibly have a pretty good market for the kind of news that I'm talking about. Two things do well on the web. One is the short update, the quick update. And if I could use a sports analogy, if we're not near the television set and our favorite NFL team is playing, we probably try to update ourselves as frequently as we can during the course of the game. There's a real market for that kind of information. I don't think that can be the future of journalism, however, because a lot of that kind of information is also within the means of ordinary citizens. And you're going to find other outlets that are going to be providing that. And in fact, oftentimes when there's a sports game going on, it's our friends who are updating us. We don't need the journalists to do that. Where we need the journalists are to do those deeper pieces. And there's some pretty good evidence, and it's getting stronger because of the tendency on the internet for niche audiences, that the pieces that draw the largest audiences, the pieces that are most likely to be passed along from one, that go viral, be passed along from one person to the next, the pieces that are likely to be evergreen, in other words, pieces that still will be drawing traffic 2, 3, 4 months after they were written, are those deeper, longer, better informed pieces. Those are the ones that seem to have legs. But that's very incomplete information on the market viability of the kind of journalism I'm talking about. But I think the old style of journalism has some market viability issues it needs to address.
Yeah. You have just hinted a little bit about business models. We have a question from Hang, who sends us the question from Paris, and would like to know how do you see the business models evolve according to the ideas that you explore in your latest book?
Well, I think it's going to take some number of different directions. What's happened in the United States is that the traditional media has been losing audience, and I think they're going to continue to lose audience. But I think there's some consolidation, a slowing of that process taking place now. So that in some ways we've got different markets at work here. One market that's growing in the United States, it's starting to grow more slowly than it was for a period of time, is the audience for partisan news. And we've not had that tradition in roughly a century in the United States. It was the 19th century tradition in the U.S., but not the 20th century tradition of journalism. And then we got the traditional media. And what we're seeing with the traditional media, counter to many of the people who said when the internet came along that we're going to have 1,000 flowers bloom, we're going to have all of these outlets, we're going to have this robust information system. What we're seeing now is some of the consolidation, some of the concentration that was taking place in the old media. And we've seen enormous concentration in the old media of ownership. We're beginning to see that happening on the web, and the reason we're seeing that happening on the web is that brand is very important on the web. So if you think about the American market, for example, and you live in Topeka, Kansas, well, you've got your local newspaper. But if you want print news, who else might you think about? Well, you might think about the New York Times. So in some ways, the local paper competes with the New York Times. If you're the New York Times and your audience, do they ever think about the Topeka newspaper? I doubt it. So in some ways, brand matters. And so we're seeing a concentration of audience around those brands. The money has not quite kept up with that movement of audience. We still haven't quite figured out how to monetize for a really solid business model online news consumption. But that's coming, and I think that will be there. And then we'll have a number of these news outlets like like nytimes.com that will have the revenues they need to do really solid, substantial, ongoing reporting. Of course, the New York Times does it already because it has a different kind of tradition. It has a much bigger newsroom. But I think we'll probably see 6, 8, 10 of these fairly substantial news outlets 10 years from now on the internet, really competing, and competing over the quality of their journalism.
Thank you. I think we can move on to a question related to the issue that Boston Global Forum will focus on next year, namely the role that social media can play to create a better, safer, more peaceful world. And we have a question from one of our collaborators who couldn't be with us tonight. And he's wondering if you could talk a little bit about the emerging role of I mean, emerging. It's already a pretty established role that social media plays in the news cycle, and how that fits into the knowledge-based news that you advocate for.
Well, I think social media at this point are overrated in terms of what they mean for public information. We've got a lot of data that indicate that much less news traffics through social media than the proponents of that as a news source would have us believe. That less than 1% of the social media traffic has anything to do with news and current affairs. If you look at the internet generally, visits to news sites are a very tiny proportion, at least in terms of what we might think. It's maybe 3% of visits are to news sites. So, I think the social media are going to be an important part of this process. To me, the social media are much more important in getting people engaged in public affairs, getting them energized, getting them mobilized. The social media do that much better than the traditional media. What they're less good at